You're tuned into More Living with Jim Brogan, broadcast live from the Brogan Financial Studios at News Talk 98.7, where old-fashioned values, expert knowledge, and genuine understanding come together to give you the retirement straight talk you deserve. Jim's a former National Advisor of the Year recipient and a financial educator, and he's here today to talk about how you can live out the best years of your life. Jim and the Brogan Financial team have been helping retirees and pre-retirees across the Southeast for over 20 years in their pursuit of financial independence. You can reach them during the week at 865-862-6800. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn, because More Living with Jim Brogan starts now.
Good morning, East Tennessee. Welcome. You're listening to More Living with Jim Brogan, where it's all about living the best years of your life your way. You're listening to News Talk 98.7 WOKI. I'm Kevin Craigenbrink, and I'm filling in for Jim this morning. He's off on a well-deserved vacation, and I think we've got a great show for you this morning. I'm really looking forward to spending some time talking this morning with Paula Johnson, who is a Knoxville foodie extraordinaire, the author of a couple of great books I'm going to talk a little bit more about here in just a minute, but somebody who has an awful lot to share with us about food in Knoxville. Now, let's sort of set the stage a little bit. From my perspective, food is probably the single most important thing other than air. I love to eat. I love to enjoy my food. I love to eat well. I'm blessed to be married to a great cook, and so she prepares a lot of meals for us at home. But we love to go out and enjoy the restaurant culture of Knoxville as well. And I love being in a place that has built into it, I guess, a fantastic restaurant culture. And what I've learned as I've gotten ready to have this conversation with Paula this morning is I've learned how rich and deep is the history of food and the culture of food in the Knoxville area. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with Paula this morning. Paula, good morning to you, and tell us a little bit about Paula. Tell us the Paula story real quick, if you would.
Well, good morning, Kevin. It's great to be here. It's great to meet you today. Well, the story of how I got involved in food in Knoxville, well, with the food tour, the Knoxville Food Tour, that I started in 2010. It was when the redevelopment of downtown was going on, and we had a lot of new business open up at that time. And at the beginning, it was mostly restaurants downtown. And I had read about these type of food tours in other larger cities like New York or Chicago. And I thought, well, I wonder if we could have one of those here, too. And so now we do.
I think that's awesome, right? So Paula mentioned it. Let me just go give you a little brief summary of where Paula's at. So Paula is the owner and the tour guide for Knoxville Food Tours. Mm-hmm. She is the author of Lost Restaurants of Knoxville, which really I enjoyed, by the way. I've got a copy of it sitting right here, and a lot of the really good history of restaurants in Knoxville, which I thought was fantastic. And then she's also the author of Unique Eats and Eateries of Knoxville, which gives a great list of some of the best and sometimes least known great food places in Knoxville. So, Paula, getting started in the food industry for you, right? Mm-hmm. There has to have been a trigger. What got you interested in that part of Knoxville's history?
Well, there was a trigger as far as being interested in food. I lived for 2 years in Louisville, Kentucky, where there is a big food culture, a culinary school, and many, many wonderful restaurants. So that's when I first got interested in sort of the culture of restaurants and dining out. And so when I saw that beginning to develop more here in Knoxville, I really wanted to be a part of that as well.
That's awesome. All right. And I know we're going to talk about some of this a little bit later, but just to tease a little bit here, I know that you've established a relationship with the Grady family, and they've had a lot to do with sort of developing the food culture.
Yes.
In Knoxville. We're going to come back to that. That was just sort of a little tease there, but I want to keep that sort of on the front burner a little bit. Some places in America, if you go there, you can sort of predict what the primary cuisine is going to be like. This city's all about seafood, or this city's all about steak, or things like that. But Knoxville doesn't seem to be known for one kind of cuisine. What do you think, if you were to say these are the things that stand out as cuisine favorites in Knoxville, what would you say?
Right. And I think it changes as well. But I think for this area, people love burgers. They love a good burger. And then I heard someone say the other day, I see tacos everywhere around here. So people are really into tacos because, of course, you can build it your own way, do so many different things with it. A lot of people ask me about kind of what you're saying. What is the food of Appalachia? So really, the food of Appalachia is not necessarily what you're going to find in restaurants here all the time. If you went to eat at someone's home, you might eat a much different meal than what you would eat out at a restaurant. Such as, the most popular meat was always ham, pork, and anything that could be preserved. Because for the early settlers and pioneers, a big thing was just making it through the winter with their food. So smoking, curing, pickling, and you will see those things come out in the restaurants now.
Yeah, I think I see as I go out around, right? Just about any place. Well, I shouldn't say it that way, but a lot of places today you can get pulled pork or some sort of a pork option and those sorts of things. It seems to me we're seeing a lot of chicken on the menu as a protein.
Fried chicken.
Yes,
definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah. So a lot of good things going on with that. We think about Knoxville as I'd say a medium-sized city, but it seems to have a lot more restaurants compacted into it than you might find in a similar-sized city.
Yes.
Can you talk to me a little bit about that? What do you think is the cause of that?
Well, one of the guests on my tour said, I've never seen a more eating and drinking town than Knoxville.
Yeah.
I think people enjoy food here, and I think they enjoy the social aspect of it. People love to go out, and they love to try new things. And talking about the types of food here, anytime something new opens, some new idea comes in, people will rush out to try it, to see what it's like. So in that way, I think it's a very open town toward food and welcoming toward new cuisine and new ideas.
That's awesome. And, one of the things that strikes me about, your role in food in Knoxville is that you took the time to write 2 books about it. Now, writing a book is not an easy project. I don't care what the book is. And you've accomplished 2 of those. I got a chance to look through those books. Tell me about the 2 books that you've written and what they're about.
Well, and it was not my idea originally to write these books. I was contacted by the publisher for the first one, Lost Restaurants of Knoxville. And this is a series that this publisher has of different cities. Lost Restaurants of Cincinnati or Lost Restaurants of wherever. So they said they were looking for someone to do a book about restaurants and dining in Knoxville. Well, so I immediately said that I would do it. not knowing, as you say, how much work goes into researching and writing a book and putting it all together. But I'm so glad that I did. And the reason they reached out to me, they had found my website about the tours. And so this book came out in 2017. And I knew right away I wanted to make it about a history of dining through the decades, from the very first tavern in town up to the beginning of the redevelopment of Market Square, which is kind of where we were at the time.
That's a good point for us to stop for just a minute. We're going to come back and talk some more about this. We're going to take a real quick break. When we come back, we're going to look at some more about the history of food in Knoxville and the history of restaurants. You're listening to More Living with Jim Brogan, only on News Talk 98.7 WOKI.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
Welcome back to More Living right here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. I am Kevin Kragenbrink, sitting in today for Jim Brogan. And we are talking this morning with Paula Johnson, and we're talking about food, one of my very favorite topics. And as we get started again, I want to go back to, we were having this little conversation about history. Mm-hmm. We were actually talking about your books, which is great, but that leads me into this conversation about history. And, you know, as I was reading through the Lost Restaurants book, mm-hmm. I was fascinated by some of the history of food in Knoxville. And you know, we really don't have time to go through all of that. I wish we did, because that's, of course, one of my passions. Mm-hmm. But since we don't have time to go through all of that, I thought I'd ask you if you had to pick 3 or 4 events or moments or periods in Knoxville's history that did the most to sort of influence the food culture here, which ones of those would you pick?
Well, you mentioned the Regas family earlier, and I think the beginning of kind of our modern restaurants began with the Greek immigrants that came into the city and started what I would say were the modern restaurants, other than what we had at first, the taverns and the saloons. Mm-hmm. So the Regas brothers really began that for me. And their influence can be seen now even throughout the city. Other restaurateurs who worked for them went on to develop their own restaurants, but kept the same type of commitment to service and quality and just a culture of hospitality. So, for instance, and these are some of my favorite restaurants out on the west side of town, Connor's and the Chop House. Those are kind of descendants of the Regas family and the Regas restaurant, and Aubrey's too. So I would say that would be my number one. And then also, you know how dining sort of changes through the years. And I kind of tried to show that in the book, going from saloons and taverns to, then I even have a chapter on restaurants that were in hotels that were very fancy and serving even French cuisine, up to the 70s and 80s with kind of the idea of continental cuisine here, and the World's Fair. I think the World's Fair just brought it all to Knoxville and gave Knoxville an idea of how things could be with bringing in different types of cuisine. And then, of course, right after the World's Fair, sort of the redevelopment of the old city with Christopher Kendrick redoing Patrick Sullivan's Saloon in the 80s, 100 years after it had first opened, and bringing the whole old city idea and concept back. So from there, I guess you would say my third big bang of Knoxville dining would have been the redevelopment of Market Square and what we have going on now in the downtown area.
Cool. Well, and I guess I can see all of those pieces fitting together. I'm sort of fascinated by the World's Fair impact, because it seems to me that when you have an event like that, that has to introduce all sorts of things into the culinary culture that just weren't even there before. Mm-hmm. All sorts of global foods and those sorts of things. Do you want to add a little bit to that part of the conversation, a little bit more about the impact of the World's Fair itself?
Well, one thing that I always think about is that there was a restaurant in the Sunsphere restaurant, and it was run by, and this is just a funny thing, but it was run by Hardee's, but it was an upscale sit-down restaurant. And then there was a Hardee's fast food restaurant at the base of the Sunsphere. But they had a Swedish chef at the Sunsphere restaurant. And one of his kind of specialty dishes that he served was Jefferson Davis pie. And I always think that is so funny that, he thought, I guess he was coming to the American South and he was trying to incorporate something that was of the American South. But so the Sunsphere restaurant, I would say. And then my family always talks about, we went to the World's Fair once, the Belgium waffles. And then, of course, a lot of people talk about Petros. And even somebody asked me the other day, because, now there's a Petros on Market Square. And they said, well, what's that all about? And so I told them of how it developed during the World's Fair. And they wanted it to be something to do with petroleum, but they did not think that sounded very appetizing. So they shortened the name to Petros. And then were very successful with it, went on to have a franchise in different states. So I think that was one of the more successful businesses that came out of it. And of course, Buddy's Barbecue was the official barbecue of the World's Fair. But the whole idea was to showcase different types of cuisine from different areas. And I think people really like that because they want to be able to try something that's new to them.
I like that too. I do like trying new foods. It's one of my favorite things to do. I have a rule. I say I'll try anything once. So it's been, and that leads to some adventures along the way. Do you know what is the? Do you know what is the oldest restaurant in Knoxville that is still open?
Oh, let's see. I think it might be Sam and Andy's. Do you think it is?
I don't know. It's just an interesting question that came to mind that I was like, well, that would be interesting to know, what is the longest standing restaurant in Knoxville today?
Well, the Rankin restaurant sort of took that title for a while. It was out on Central, but they've closed now. So I'm thinking Sam and Andy's maybe.
Okay. I like that. Okay. I have to go back to Sam and Andy's, check them out again, right? Okay. One more quick thing on history before we move on from that topic in general. Dave Thomas, the founder of Wendy's. He's got a Knoxville connection, right?
Yes.
Can you tell me about that history a little bit, and how did he get his start in the restaurant business? How does that play out?
Well, Dave Thomas was the best friend of Bill Regas, and he came to Knoxville, and when he was a teenager, wanted to find a job, and he had actually lied about his age, said that he was older than he was so that he could get a job. And they hired him at the Regas restaurant. And so he and Bill worked together and they became best friends. But one of the things that Bill told me was that they would make sandwiches for workers that were going over to Oak Ridge to work. So that, of course, Regas for a long time was open 24 hours. So they would come in really early and people would come by and pick up their lunches, their sandwiches to take to work with them at Oak Ridge. But when Dave Thomas decided he was going to move on to another town, they said, well, you just come back here anytime that you want a job with us. And he said, well, no, I'm going to have a lot of my own restaurants one day. And they kind of laughed and they said, well, David, they called him David, how are you going to do that? And he did it. So I think it's a wonderful story, but years later, Dave Thomas, after he had, created Wendy's, and Wendy's grew to be the third largest fast food chain in America, he said he credited all his success back to his time working at the Regas restaurant and values that they had taught him there. So even though he used a little bit of, not such a good value as getting in by lying about his age, he learned the benefits of doing the right thing and working hard. So he's another example of someone that worked for the Regas restaurant and the Regas family who went on to have a great success.
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing that. That's awesome. We're getting ready to take another break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation about food in Knoxville. Hopefully, we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty on some great restaurants and what we can expect to find there. You are listening to More Living right here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI, and we'll be back in just a minute.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
Thanks for tuning in to More Living with Jim Brogan right here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. I am Kevin Kragenbrink. I'm filling in for Jim today. We're visiting this morning with Paula Johnson, a Knoxville food expert, and we're discussing food in Knoxville and all the things that go with that. But before we get back to Paula, it's time right now for Dollars and Cents with Jim Brogan.
Want to be sure you are getting the most out of your retirement? For all the years of your retirement? That's the primary goal of More Living with Jim Brogan and our Dollars and Cents segment, where we provide you with an important financial tip that will help positively impact the quality of your life in retirement. And now, here's Jim with this week's Dollars and Cents tip.
Or as I get asked very, very often, Jim, do I need a trust? Do we need a trust? And it's a very general question that is rather intricate below the surface. And so to answer that question, I'm going to put it in a couple of different ways. You know, there could be one or two different ways generally, people are speaking about when they say, do I need a trust? One is, do you need a trust before you pass? And the other is, do you need a trust after you're gone? And those are really two completely different things. Usually when I hear, Jim, do we need a trust? More often than not, it's dealing with what happens to your assets when you are gone. And the reason you would leave assets into a trust usually is for some level of protection, whether it's to protect the kids against themselves, where they cannot access the money too quickly. You could leave a kid too much money too soon. You could really hurt them, ruin their lives. So a lot of times it's for that reason. Sometimes it's for creditor protection. Maybe you have a child that's a doctor and you want those assets to be protected. Or if it's a large estate, you may want it to be protected from, the in-laws, because in-laws can become outlaws. What if your daughter gets a divorce? So protection, if you have a disabled child and you don't want them to be disqualified for government benefits, if you leave them too much money, if their needs tested benefits, they could be disqualified. But if you leave it in trust, it's a different story. So usually it's for some sort of reduction in access or for some kind of control. It could be control for your spouse if your spouse were to remarry or if you're in a second marriage. So control, restricted access. But that's for when you're gone. The other reason sometimes people will ask that question, do I need a trust, is referring to setting that trust up now. And what they're really asking is how the assets are administered upon their death. And usually what that's getting to is if you create a living trust and put your assets in the living trust, then they would go directly to your heirs after you're gone. And those are really two different things. So that's an important thing to answer, because if your concern is what happens to the money for your kids or your heirs, and you want either restrictions or control or protection, then that really has nothing to do with whether you would have a trust now. And so having a trust now, the number one thing that comes up is the difference between will-based planning and trust-based planning. In a will-based plan, the will, when you pass away, will create the trust. But if it's going through the will and then going into the trust for your heirs, that means it will go through probate. Probate in Latin means prove the will. Trust-based planning is where you put everything in the trust now, or you name the trust as a direct beneficiary, and then it bypasses probate and directly goes into that trust upon your death. But that's really a different mechanism entirely. That's talking about how your estate gets administered upon your death. Does it take time? Is it private? Does it cost money? All of those questions. So they're two different things. Now, the other thing that could come up with a trust now is you might create a trust now and make irrevocable gifts. It could be to benefit someone else. It could be to benefit a charity or a church. You might do that to provide benefits for you now, in addition to tax benefits that eventually would be passed either to your loved ones or to the church or charity. But those are really more complicated things. So normally when I am asked, Jim, do I need a trust? It's really about how the estate is going to be administered when you pass away. Will there be a probate process? And then the second part of that is, do you want some sort of protection or restrictions or control of those assets upon your death? So ultimately, these are important estate planning considerations that should be coordinated with all of your professionals, including your financial planning, your estate planning, and your tax planning.
That's our Dollars and Cents segment for this week. You can find this week's Dollars and Cents segment and others by visiting BroganFinancial.com.
Thanks, Jim, for that dollars and cents tip. To follow Jim, to learn more about his upcoming adult education at the University of Tennessee at Pellissippi State, you can go to BroganFinancial.com and click on the link for classes. We are talking this morning with Paula Johnson, and she's been filling us in on some of the food history and food culture of Knoxville and the areas around us. One of the things I notice about food culture in Knoxville, and I've been in Knoxville since 2005, so I'm not a Knoxville native. Mm-hmm. And I have lived in a lot of places around the country, and I love the experience in all those places. But one of the things that struck me when I first moved to Knoxville, and I think it's still true, is we have a lot of franchise restaurants here, a lot of chain restaurants. Yes. And they seem to be popping up constantly all the time. And then also, though, there's a great mix of the locally owned, sort of call them mom and pop type restaurants. Mm-hmm. Seeing those things in such volume together is almost sort of a question mark by itself. Can you talk a little bit about how that works in Knoxville?
It's almost overwhelming. Well, Knoxville is a test market for a lot of franchise restaurants. So you may have heard that before, and that's why we get a lot of these franchise restaurants coming in. But people right now, and people like that because they do like a sense of consistency sometimes. But right now people are very interested in the local restaurants, supporting local restaurants, going somewhere where maybe you know the owner or you've frequented it so much that you've become friends with the owner. So people have a lot of choices that they can make when they're dining out. So my second book, Unique Eats and Eateries of Knoxville, is kind of a dining guide of restaurants in all different neighborhoods around town that are locally owned. And this one, even though both of these books are about food, they are very different books. One is more of the history of dining throughout the years in town and features many of the favorite restaurants that people may have loved to go to, and they love to remember these restaurants and having good times there. And then the new book is about helping people find new favorite restaurants. And like you mentioned, some of the lesser known and smaller restaurants in town.
Yeah, I like that. As I was looking through the book, one thing that I picked up on is how many of those restaurants, there's a, and this seems to be a pattern in Knoxville, and maybe it is everywhere, but I wouldn't have noticed it without your book necessarily, is, someone will be a chef at a great restaurant, and they'll develop a set of skills or talents or a specific cuisine that they become expert at. Yes. And then that person, as a chef, goes out and starts their own restaurant. And I love how that seems to be happening throughout Knoxville. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, and another thing that seems pretty consistent is that a lot of people are taught how to cook first by their grandmother. Most of the people that I talked to and interviewed said they started cooking with their grandmother when they were a child in the kitchen. And grandmothers are good like that and dealing with children. And then, like you say, many of them went on to study at culinary schools and work in great restaurants or great hotels. There is a tremendous amount of pressure in that type of job, though. It's very physically demanding, but also very mentally demanding. And a lot of people just get a little bit burnt out with the amount of hours they have to put in, the demands that are made on them. So, or maybe they just have always had a lifelong dream to own their own restaurant and finally have the chance to do it. And once they have been out in the world and learned certain skills, of course, their culinary skills, but also just business skills in general and dealing with the public, interacting with people, communication, then maybe they feel more confident in going out on their own. So when a person opens their own restaurant, they have the opportunity to set their own hours. So, for instance, maybe they want to do a breakfast and lunch place. Like there are a lot of those around town now, Ollie B or Pete's. Or maybe they just want to have a really nice upscale dinner restaurant like J.C. Holdway or Amelia. So that is one good thing. They have the opportunity to do that and also to choose their own type of concept. Maybe they've always loved Italian food and they want to focus on Italian food. Or maybe they even want to just do a food truck and be mobile and move around and do events. So being your own boss gives you some flexibility to do that. And I think it's more of a possibility now because people can do their own advertising on social media. They can develop a following of customers and clients. So in a way, going that route is almost a better choice for a lot of them, a lot of the chefs.
Yeah, I think that's right. Knoxville's a great town for entrepreneurs.
Yes.
We're going to take one more quick break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask a few questions about Knoxville's food today and get us thinking about that. You are listening to More Living right here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. We'll be back in just a minute.
Welcome back to News Talk 98.7's Brogan Financial Studios, where Jim Brogan is coming to you live with important news and advice to help you achieve your dream retirement. Get ready to learn and live. Here's your host, Jim Brogan.
You have been listening to More Living right here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. I'm Kevin Kragenbrink, sitting in for Jim Brogan, who's on vacation this week, and I am talking with Paula Johnson. This has been a great conversation, talking about food in Knoxville. Paula, I have a question for you. Just sort of a thing that I think is kind of cool. What has come to be called the farm to table movement.
Yes.
Has been sort of really popular the last decade or so. Do you think, or can you talk about what you think is the impact of that movement on Knoxville restaurants?
Yes, and I was just thinking of that when you were talking about people wanting to eat at the locally run restaurants, because many times they will be using local products. And People love that. Food always tastes better when it's fresh and local and in season. So that drives a lot of the food movement right now. People looking for that and wanting to have a taste of what's in season, what's coming from the local farms. And I think it's wonderful too, because that way it's even more of a way of supporting your own community. It's one thing to go and support a favorite local restaurant, but then that adds into it when that restaurant is supporting local farms around the area. So it's a wonderful thing that's happened.
I like it. That's excellent stuff. All right. I want to make sure we get this in while we're sitting here. Tell us about the food tour and tell people how they can get to take advantage of the food tour.
Yes. Well, it's a walking tour, and we will visit 4 or 5 different restaurants. It's downtown, and we'll do tastings at each one. And I tell a little narrated history of the city as we go from place to place. It lasts around 3 hours, and people can purchase a ticket to go on the website. It's just knoxvillefoodtours.com. And there's a page to buy tickets. There's a calendar that will show the dates and times that are available. But it generally runs around the weekends. Well, this week we're doing Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So there's a great chance to get in. And it's usually in the afternoons. We say it's tastings or samplings, but there is quite a bit of food. So I would not necessarily eat before I come. And it is enough for a meal and more for most people.
Sounds like fun. All right.
Yes.
And KnoxvilleFoodTours.com. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. That's awesome. Listen, if you're listening out there and you want to take a chance to go out and see some of these great restaurants and get some good history of the food, the downtown Knoxville area, look Paula up and take advantage of that. All right. Here we go. I've got some rapid fire questions for you here.
Oh,
all right.
goodness.
You ready for this? I want to ask you this question. What are your favorite restaurants for the following cuisines? Right. So just a quick answer for each one. Favorite pizza restaurant?
This is so hard. I like Dazzo's. I like Hard Knocks.
Wait, that's more than one favorite. I like it. Okay. What about burger?
Abridged.
Abridged. Okay. What about Southern cuisine?
Well, I love Myrtle's on Market Square.
Myrtle's on Market Square. Good. I've never been there. I'm going to have to try that.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Good fried chicken.
Okay. What about Middle Eastern?
Copita downtown.
Okay.
It's fabulous.
All right. Asian?
I like the Stir Fry Cafe in Bearden.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about barbecue?
Barbecue. I like Oakwood. They have the little food truck, but it's fantastic barbecue.
Okay. I got 2 more for you. Italian.
Well, I love Amelia. I think it's so nice.
Okay. And the last one, just fine dining in general, your favorite place in Knoxville for fine dining?
I would say Oliver Royale on Market Square.
All right. That sounds excellent. That is very good stuff. All right. So the thing we've been talking about today is food in Knoxville. I love food. I enjoy every bit of it. We've been talking with Paula Johnson. I want to encourage everybody to go and look up her website at knoxvillefoodtours.com. Go pick up a copy of her books, both of them, Lost Restaurants of Knoxville, Unique Eats and Eateries of Knoxville. This lady has got some great things to add to your understanding of food in Knoxville, and I have really enjoyed this conversation this morning. I appreciate all of you tuning in with us today and being a part of the show. You have been listening to More Living right here on News Talk 98.7 WOKI. This is Kevin Kragenbrink saying have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much.
The views expressed by Jim Brogan and his guests are not that of Cumulus Media. Any discussion of financial, legal, and tax planning strategies is not intended to be individualized advice and is general in nature. Always consult with your advisor for advice specific to your needs. This program's content does not represent a recommendation of any particular security, strategy, or investment by Jim Brogan or Brogan Financial Incorporated.